You fool! Warren is dead.
Part 10. The Quaker's Secret. There was no school on Friday. Betsy woke to the strange hush of a weekday without a timetable, the house not quite sure what it was meant to be doing, the low murmur of the television downstairs, and the steady, restless clink of a teaspoon against a mug. She pulled her duvet up to her chin and lay still for a moment, listening. A newsreader's voice carried faintly through the floorboards. Unidentified assailant. Tragic events in Lowther. Police are appealing for witnesses. Betsy swung her legs out of bed and dressed without need of a prompt. Her hair was a mound the shape of a ghastly black mass, the shape of a thing she saw each and every time she closed her eyes. Downstairs, Steve sat on the sofa in yesterday's clothes, shoulders hunched, mug in hand. The living room was lit by the TV's cold glow. On the screen, Market Street looked like it belonged to a different world. Blue and white tape, police vans, a reporter with a stern expression stamped on his face. "You hungry?" he asked as Betsy entered the room, glancing at her absently. She shook her head. "Me neither," he muttered, and took another sip of the pale brown stuff. Betsy watched him. There was a tightness about him. A man braced for action. "You all right, Dad?" she asked quietly. Steve looked at her then, properly. The concern in his eyes was immediate. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "The world's gone mad." Betsy sank into the armchair next to him, knees tucked up. The stench of the canal still filled her nostrils, and those wet, crunching sounds. The news report cut briefly to the canal, footage from earlier in the week. The towpath cordoned off, a policeman holding a hand up to block the lens. Then back to Market Street, to the question everyone was asking. What was it? Where had it gone? A knock sounded at the door. Steve frowned. "Stay there," he told Betsy, as though she might suddenly leap up and sprint into the waiting arms of danger. He crossed the hallway, peered through the spy hole, then opened the door suspiciously. A man stood there, a thin chap in his late 60s. He wore a neat dark suit, far too formal for Buckingham Street. The trousers neatly ironed, the jacket glossy and sharp. His cold grey eyes were like slits with black, pupilless blobs at the centre. "Morning," Steve said wearily. "Can I help you?" The man swallowed. I apologize for calling unannounced." His voice was as thin as the man himself, clipped and flat. Steve just stared at him, as if to say, "Go on." The caller cleared his throat. "My name isn't important," he said. "Not really, but I'm here on behalf of the Society of Friends." Steve blinked. "The what?" "Quakers," the man said quickly. Betsy, listening by the door in the living room, felt something in her stomach turn. Something slid into place. "Oh," Steve said, only fractionally less baffled. "And what do you want exactly?" The man glanced down the street, seemed to eye number 44 carefully. Then the dead street lamp. "Please," he went on. "May I come in? He wet his lips. "It isn't safe to speak out here." Steve hesitated. There was something about the man's face, the twitching eye, the shade of fear it wore, that pushed him to yield. "All right," he said, dropping his guard for the moment. The Quaker entered, his dark eyes scanning the interior quizzically. Betsy edged away from the living room door. She didn't want to be seen, just wanted to listen. The Quaker's gaze shot towards the living room. From where he stood, he could see the television and winced at the ongoing news report, the worried faces and the ruined shop fronts. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Steve stared at him, tried to process the twisted expression on the man's face. The Quaker drew a breath, then spoke as if reciting something he'd been practicing in advance. "Your daughter visited the local meeting house yesterday?" Steve glanced at Betsy's shoes by the radiator, her coat hanging neatly on the peg. The girl herself held her breath. "You mean the place on Warren Road?" "Yes," the Quaker said. "I'm obligated to keep an eye." Steve folded his arms. "Go on," and this time he really said it. "In the cellar there," the man began, drawing a breath the length of a pool cue. "Items are kept in storage, items gathered by travelling men and explorers in days gone by. Call it a collection, if it pleases you." Steve's brow furrowed. "What kind of items?" The man's eyes danced again towards the living room, caught sight of Betsy's shadow. "Odds and ends, curios, that sort of thing." "Right," Steve said, somewhat impatiently. "And what, my daughter was poking about in there?" "Listen," the man said, stepping a little too close to Steve for comfort. "There was something down there, kept for many years, that, unfortunately, was very recently disturbed." Steve made to call out to Betsy, but the thin man put a restraining hand on his arm. The hand was deathly pale and icy cold. "This thing," the man said, trembling now, "escaped. Fleshless it is, bloodless, like air, like breath. It roams and roams, entirely unseen, and until it finds somewhere to live." Steve let out a short, humourless laugh. "What do you want? It embeds itself," the Quaker cut in a host, a person, and once it's inside, it feeds." Betsy felt her skin prickle. "Feeds? Feeds on what?" Steve asked, very quietly now, one half of him stupidly curious, the other half eager to toss the stranger out onto the street. "The belly of the bodiless is never full," the Quaker said, nodding strangely. "It is hungry, always hungry, hungry for animals, carrion, until—" Steve's jaw clenched. The Quaker swallowed audibly. "Until it needs something more to satisfy its craving." A silence settled in the hallway, and in the passing of those quiet moments, Steve seemed to recover his senses. "All right," he said. "That's enough. But," the Quaker cut in, his eyes shining with something like grief, "the host cannot sustain it indefinitely. Eventually it must leave, goes in search of a new host." Betsy thought of the maw, the cracking bone, the wet, chewing sounds. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Steve sighed, rolled his eyes. "Well, what is it? Where did it come from?" "It was recovered in the mid-19th century," the thin man said, seemingly relieved to have been given another chance to speak. "An archaeological dig in the Balkans, they say. A burial site." Steve's voice hardened. "So what's it got to do with me and my daughter?" "Your daughter has become entangled," he said softly. "She and her friends discovered the empty vessel, so now it knows them. Such is the nature of the relationship between it and its prison." Betsy felt an awful chill, as if someone had spoken her name from a distance. Steve's mouth opened and closed. He wanted to doubt the man, write him off as a lunatic, but somehow he couldn't. If there was the slightest possibility Betsy was in danger, then it was his fatherly duty to protect her. The Quaker continued, pushing on before courage could fail him. "The current host," he said, "is a woman named Cecelia Davenport." "Who?" Betsy knew. The name hit her like a slap, even though she'd never heard it before. It belonged to the neat garden, the silent house, the woman the kids called the bag lady. The Quaker flinched again. "Ask your daughter." Steve took a step back, hands raking through his hair. "Okay, I think it's time to leave." "I just want you to understand," the Quaker went on. "Understand what? That there's a monster roaming the streets? A monster that wants to eat my daughter? Come on." The Quaker met his gaze, dark eyes serious. "Yes." Silence again. In the living room, the TV continued its steady churn of half-truths. The Quaker shifted, as though realizing he'd said as much as he could, as much as he should about the strange entity in their midst. "A terrible task must be performed," he said. "Keep your daughter behind closed doors." He turned to leave. Steve didn't stop him. He stood rigid, as if his frame was caught between disbelief and some deeper, more terrifying recognition. The Quaker stepped out onto the front step and paused. For a moment, he looked up and down Buckingham Street, shoulders hunched against the cold. Then his gaze lifted to number 44 and its immaculate garden. He studied it the way an explorer studies the mouth of a cave. "Fire burns eternally in the belly of the bodiless," he said cryptically, then walked away, disappearing into the pale morning. Steve closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut, shaking his head. Betsy retreated to the armchair, her mind racing. She understood now, some of what was going on at least. Steve straightened, slipped on the familiar mask of calm, and drifted into the living room. Betsy stared at him. He seemed to hesitate, looked like he wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure how to say it. Just stay inside today, yeah? No messing about, curfew or not." He wasn't going to tell her about the visitor, wasn't going to tell her what the thin man had said. And Betsy wasn't going to ask. To ask would create a situation, an atmosphere, as Steve would describe it. Betsy nodded obediently. Better her dad wasn't aware of the big picture. He might do more to restrain her, if that was the case. No, she'd find a way to communicate with her friends, to formulate a plan of action. Perhaps she'd sneak out after lunch, visit them one by one. Something had to be done about Cecelia Davenport.